Good morning, everybody. We just have a bunch of people coming into the room, so I will admit everyone in. We'll give it a minute whilst we get everyone into the session. Happy Thursday. And we're going to kick off a session in a moment on using the Brightspace Rubrics tool to help with your assessment, the way that we work through our assessment workflows, etc. So basically, this is a session that's going to look at making you feel more comfortable with the Brightspace Rubrics tool. That is the bottom line of what we're trying to achieve here. We might have people coming in, so I'll admit them as they come. Okay. So you're welcome to put things into the chat as we go through. I have provided the link to the Padlet board that I'm using for presenting in the Teaching Academy channel, but I'll grab it again here for you if you're interested in adding to it or looking at it as we go. There it is. All right, so today's session is about the Brightspace Rubrics tool, as I said. We're going to be looking at a number of different questions with using this tool, but really I thought I'd start with these ones as a starting point. What is this thing? I will just mute others in the room. Let's go with that. What is the rubric tool? Where does it live? How do I build one? How do I mark with it? Is there a difference in using the rubrics tool between talking about master sites and session subject sites? Can I move them? Can I delete them? What else can I do with them? So that is my starting point. I am happy to build on that and be distracted and go in other directions as long as we have addressed these base questions. As I said, you're welcome to add other comments and questions to the Padlet board underneath. There's comments there, and I'll come back to that as we go. I do have a number of exemplar sites to show you the way that rubrics are being used in different ways. For marking, some of them are really quite interesting from my point of view. People sort of working outside the traditional lines of what a rubric has been used for in the past. But hopefully you're going to see some possibilities for your own use coming out of this session. So I will work through some of those exemplary sites. I will obviously want to work through the process of building a rubric and how to do that quickly and easily. So I'm going to do that as well. But I think maybe I'm going to start with showing you some of the ways that other people are using rubrics, and then we can work towards how you can achieve that yourself. So hopefully that sounds okay to those of you in this morning's session, and we'll go from there. All right, so let's bring up some examples. If we jump into Brightspace, what have we got here? CLS 300 for this session has some rubrics. So the first question I put on there is, where do we find the rubric tool? And we have a couple of ways to access it, but for me, the easiest way is to jump into your subject admin area, as long as you have appropriate staff access. So that's going to be convener, coordinator, additional academic, and any of the other supporty roles like the designers, etc., that we have in the session this morning. You'll find rubrics underneath the assessment area. We jump into rubrics and you'll get a list of all of the rubrics that are in place for that subject, whether they're being used or not. This one, interestingly, they have copied and pasted a description for the rubric from somewhere else into this text area to the right of a rubric that's being used here, which is quite interesting because no student will ever actually see this. So I'm not sure why that's entirely been done, but there you have it. The name of the rubric is there on the left, so they've got one there for simulation-based assessment. And this little chain link, in case you're wondering what that's for, tells me that it has been attached to an assignment or a quiz, but has yet to be used for marking, because once it is used for marking, we get a padlock next to them and we can't change them. When you have a rubric that sits inside your list, there's quite a lot that you can do with it from this area, including edit the rubric as long as it's not locked. You can run through looking at it in a preview. You can also look at statistics, which we're going to spend some time on later on. That is an excellent way to access what's happening with that rubric for your marking. You can also duplicate it. So if you get to the point where you have a rubric that you really want to either use again or modify, but it is locked, copy it, work on the copy is the first tip for today. So I'm going to open up this particular rubric and have a look at it. We're now looking at the rubric editor, and I'm going to work through this in detail when we build our own, but I'm just curious to see what sort of rubric this is that's being used in CLS 300 for marking. And they have set up a rubric with 5 columns or criterion scales, if you will. But in this case, instead of using the traditional HD through to fail, left to right, they have in fact reversed those, and they're working with lower scores through to higher scores. Some people want to work that way, which means that you can utilize this function that says reverse level order here, and that will switch around your values. If you want to go low to high, very simple to do. Along the left, we have a series of criterion, although the word criterion has been removed here from their descriptions. And this is a points-based rubric where every criterion is worth 6 marks. Ultimately, if we scroll down in the rubric tool, we're going to see all of those tallied together, saying that this rubric will give us a total of out of 42. And then at the end of the marking process, once this is attached to an assessment, it will convert that value or that score to whatever the task weighting is. So there's our first kind of main takeaway for today, which is the value of the rubric does not have to match whatever your assessment value is. It will always convert it automatically to whatever the task weighting is. So as an example, most nursing subjects that I've seen will always use their rubrics to score out of 100, and that will be converted back to whatever the task weighting is. Underneath our individual criterion in the rubric tool, whether they have scores or not, there is an area called overall score, which does not have any bearing on this mark or what goes through for the student, but is very, very important for us to use when we want to get statistics on the marking of the task using this rubric. So I'm going to talk more about that analytic side of things, but it all relies upon the overall score section being accurate. So a lot of people leave this or ignore this or put in not applicable or delete columns or leave it as some kind of generic level 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. Don't do that. I'm suggesting that you spend the 5 minutes to actually populate this with the overall grades for the rubric and the percentages, figure them out. What's a fail, pass, credit, distinction, etc. in terms of the starting point for each of those. So again, these guys have gone low to high, but normally you'd be working HD through to fail. All right, so that's one example of a rubric template that's been put in place in a subject that hasn't been used yet for marking. Let's look at some more. Next one up, I've got a nursing subject here. They have hundreds and hundreds of students. It ran in 60. When they did their marking in their rubrics, if we jump into one of the assessments, let's find one. So 427 students. We'll pick on some of these and have a look. I might choose this one down the bottom. These guys have got an OSCE, so an observation. And for their OSCE, if we find a student that's been marked, here we go. Looking at the evaluation of this assignment, it has a rubric. Wait, there's not one rubric. There's 4 different rubrics being used to mark this assessment. Different attempts, different aspects of the task, and they have a rubric for each. So, second takeaway, you don't just have to have one rubric. If there are different elements to the task and you want each to have their own rubric, you can attach as many as you need to. I'm not aware of a numbered limit. I've seen 5 at one point. Most people only have one, but you can add multiple rubrics. Inside our marking interface, where we get usually the preview on the left, the overall grade and score on the right, the rubrics sit up here at the top right. And if we open some of these up, maybe I'll open up the full screen view. We can see that these rubrics have different sections. So they're not just using HD through to fail for their scoring, they actually have their own scales that they've put in place for an observation. And the reason that this has happened is because when they're doing this particular task, they are out in the workplace and they are probably using mobile devices like tablets, etc., to be able to tap on each of the criterion to mark the student's performance. And that has been recorded and travelled straight through to the gradebook, to the actual student's score. So this is quite an interesting use of a rubric. They have satisfactory, unsatisfactory areas. They have some areas that use 3 criterion, other areas that use 5 or more criterion. We can do all those things inside the Brightspace rubric, and I'm going to show you how. So I just thought it's interesting to see how other schools and subjects are using the rubric tool. Observations, interactive orals, lots of other scenarios for how this tool can be used for marking beyond HD through to fail, percentages 0 to 100, etc. Okay, another example. Here we have a midwifery subject from 60, and they have attached rubrics for marking for a bunch of students. We might have a look in the rubrics area again, subject admin, assessment, rubrics. And we can see that these are all locked because they've been used for marking in that past session. And over here on the right, it's telling me that some of these rubrics are used for text only, which means they're not quantitative rubrics or points-based rubrics. They've been used to give a qualitative set of feedback to the students. So, yep, whether it's satisfactory, unsatisfactory, or pass, fail, or simply saying, well, it's a HD, but they don't use the numbers in the rubric to tally the final score. These are the ones that are quantitative and have been locked. Let's have a look at them. In this case, I want to show you that the statistics in these rubrics, if I click on View Stats, will give us some great information about the spread of student results for this task. So if I click on Competency Activities in the Stats area, this is telling me that we had 81 submissions of this assignment. The average level for the task was a pass, equating to 60.9 or so in here. There's our first view, giving us a spread of how the marking's going. I don't have to wait for these to be published to get this information. What that means is that as your markers are working through marking with a rubric, this is updated live. So you don't have to wait for publishing. You don't have to hide any assessment portals or gradebook columns. All you need is for the rubric to have been used for marking, and the convener or whoever needs it gets this information about the spread, and we can go further with that. Let's have a look at this actions button over here on the right. It's going to tell me what that actually breaks down to percentage-wise. And then I can dig further into the individual criterion in the rubric and have a look at the first one, and we get the spread against each criterion within the rubric. So that's pretty good. Then we can go further again and get into individual stats in the rubric. So for students, we're now getting a top-down view of all of the students' scores for a task based on what went into the rubric. So this is pretty good, given that we no longer have to wait for all of the publishing to be finished and everything else. We can see it live. This can also then be filtered if we wanted to look at it by marker. So I'm seeing all of the papers that have been marked by this student for this marker, for example. And the right-hand side here tells me when the marking was done. So if you were ever after a way to check when marking was happening, dates, times, etc., we have a tool that can do that here. So we get the spread of the students. We can filter this. We can narrow it down if we need to. We can filter by marking date. We can filter by marker. We can also filter by name, etc., or we can search for them. And then last but not least, we can also filter by either group or section as well. So if you want to have a look in here at the rubrics, the results for students from Bathurst Distance, you can do that with sections. If you want to get into it and look at marking teams because you've split them up or created them using the groups tool, you can filter by your groups that way as well. So it is quite a versatile way of engaging with the marking as it's happening, which is very distinct from the moderation tool for those of you familiar with that, which requires that the marking process be entirely finished, locked down and hidden from students, both submission portal and gradebook column. This is available live once the rubric has started to be used for marking. So it is a really good reason why you need to invest the time in setting a rubric up properly so that you can start with the spread of grades across the task in general and then dig further in if you need to. Now I realize I've been racing through demonstrating some of the value in this tool, but the rest of the time really I'm going to spend into using it and building within it. So let me stop there for a moment and see if anyone has any burning questions or comments at that point. How do we feel about all of that? People happy with that? Jane, you're right, gives you great evidence around to collect around your tasks. It's not hard to set up, Sonia. It's not hard to set up, and I'm going to show you how to do that now. But it is definitely worth setting up properly once at least, and that's why I want to talk a little bit about master and session sites. When you have a rubric in place and even connected to an assessment in your master site, it will be pushed out every time the subject is delivered. So you only have to set it up once. That's the first message. So you put the time in once to creating the rubric and attaching it, and then it will be available every time you run the subject. If you've done it in the session site, and a lot of people are doing that, we're sort of building things as we go, attaching them, we can copy them back very easily from the session subject site that you're teaching in back to the master. But either way, we want to end up with the rubrics that you're using attached to your assessments in the master site. Ultimately, that's what we want for moving forward. All right, so I think with all that said, I want to get into building our first rubric in the rubric tool in Brightspace. So let me find a space where I can do that. We'll get this Teams share thing out of the way. And I'm going to build one inside my subject zone. All right, so as with finding the rubrics, building rubrics from scratch, the easiest way to do it is to go into your subject admin area, down to assessment and rubrics. Let's open it up. And I'm going to build a new rubric. All right, so we give it a name and make sure that the name is clear enough that it's easy for you to find later and know what it's for. Now that may mean that it's attached to a particular assessment task, whatever the name of that task might be. Maybe you've attached it to a particular session, for example. Make this as specific as you can so you can find it later on, is what I'm getting at. The students are not going to see the name of the rubric. So this is for you to be able to track this down. On the basically, you're working back from, at some point in the future, you're going to have lots of rubrics and you want to be able to find it quickly and easily. So make it specific. What else can we see in this interface? Let me zoom in a little. Right, over here on the right-hand side, you'll notice that we have auto saving. You don't have to click save anywhere. It's saving as it goes. And then over on the top right, we have a status area that says published. The options there are published, archived, and draft. Unless your rubric is set to published, you will not be able to attach it to an assessment. So make sure this says published. Always go back and check that. It's on by default, but if you've ever copied a rubric or tried to work on it after the fact, it can switch back to draft occasionally. Always just check that corner to make sure it says published. All right, so we've given it a name. Let's move on to the next areas in the rubric. Type, you've got analytic and holistic. I'm going to save you some time here. Just choose analytic. A holistic rubric is a single criterion rubric. It's kind of without a lot of value. And if you only wanted one criterion, you always have the ability to delete the ones you don't want to use. So just leave this on analytic. Then we have our scoring area, which tells me, are we going to use this as a qualitative or a quantitative rubric? Tallying for the result, or do you actually want to just give them an indication visually of how they've gone in the task without using it to score the results? So no score would be a qualitative rubric. Points is where we can see here against each of our criterion scales, there is a number value, but a points rubric will use that same value for every criterion. And we can see here on the right-hand side, out of 4, out of 4, out of 4, out of 4. We can't change any of those individual criterion points values here with a points rubric. If you want to actually change that so that you put in the value and decide that different criterion have different values, you need to choose custom points. And at that point, we can now define all of those values individually for every criterion. So criterion columns down the left, you can click in here and start editing those. Just as a heads up, the limit character-wise for information going into either the criterion labels or the scale labels is 250 characters. Your actual description areas or your descriptors for them, the limit is 500 characters. So you just need to keep in mind that there is a text limit for how much you can put in each. The labels, 250, the descriptors, 500. Now, if you want to add more columns, so we've got 4 here, for example, to start with that have got this whole level business. I can add a 5th by clicking on the plus. You can add as many as you like. And I'll show you an example later on of someone who's added in 10 because they want the markers just to be clicking once on their different areas without adjusting scores. Right, so I've now got 5 columns and they're talking about levels, which is no good to me. So probably I'd be changing this to HD, distinction, credit, get rid of that. I've clicked the wrong button. Credit, pass, and fail. These labels will only be at the top of this area. If this needed more information, such as percentages, where we were saying that this is in fact 85 to 100%, you could put that in as well. I'm not going to do it for each of these. You get the idea. So you can create as many scale columns as you need. You can also add additional criterion. It gives you 3 by default. You can delete them if you don't want them, or you can in fact either duplicate the existing row or add another one underneath. Add a criterion, and now we have another area. And then you change those labels and put in your criterion labels along the left-hand side. Try and keep these concise, I would suggest. I know everyone's basically copying and pasting from the subject outline, for example, into these different areas. But with a 250 character limit in the label size, some of you have very, very long labels for your criterion. You're probably going to need to make them a little bit more concise in this tool. Otherwise, it'll cut off the text and tell you you've got too many. All right, so there's our labels. Add in as many criterion as you like. Decide on whether you're using no points, points, or custom points. In this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say I want to mark this particular task out of 100. So at that point, I'm going to say the first criterion is going to be worth 30. Next one might be worth 25. Next one might be worth 15. How are we doing here? 40, 70. And another one might be worth 10. Going to need some more criterion. You'll see the total is being represented down here at the bottom. And at that point, let's just make this one 20, so save myself some hassle. All right, so I'm now marking this rubric out of 100. Brightspace will have a crack at identifying the distribution between the points, but these aren't going to line up necessarily with our own scales for how we attribute marks. So you're going to need to figure out the scoring and whether or not you want the starting point for your markers when they click on each of the rubric areas to be the top of the band, the middle of the band, the bottom of the band, for example. So a distinction, for example, would work through 75 to 84%. But when one of your markers clicks on this scale as part of their marking, do you want it to be set at 84, 75, somewhere in between? That's up to you. But you'll need to actually figure that out, at which point you get the calculator out and go, criterion value 30 divided by 100 times 84% gives me, and identify what your band marks are. I would suggest if you're starting out using this tool that you identify the top of the band and use that as your starting point. So for a credit, for example, that's going to be 74%, for example. Figure out what that is. Once we do start marking with this tool, your markers will be able to grade within a range, which means they can adjust it down. And that might be part of your advice to them when they're doing the marking. You start by clicking, it'll give them a high credit. If it needs to be adjusted down, you can. The other tip that I'll give you here is that your HD column must always be set at the maximum value as the starting point. You can't set this lower or midway through the band. It won't tally correctly. HD must always be the max value. The others you've got some discretion over. If you want fail to be 0, if you want it to be 20, 40, whatever, that's up to you. All of these are discretionary. The HD value must be the maximum. So you're populating your labels, your scales, and your values in a points or custom points based rubric. And then you're going to go through the exercise of copying and pasting your descriptors from your subject outline. And the end result will be a rubric with however many criterion you have, tallying to a certain score if you're using a points-based rubric. And I'm going to keep moving through this interface to show you what else you can do. Underneath the area where you might add further criterion, there's also an option here to add a criteria group. This is how we create different sections inside the rubric. So this first area, for example, has been tallying scores up to 100, and I've been putting criterion labels in. If I add another criterion group, this will give me a separate section of the rubric that I can use for whatever I want to use it for. So for example, if I didn't want to have HD through to fail for this area, I can delete these scales, and maybe I want this part of the marking process to be looking at things like satisfactory, unsatisfactory. If I don't need these to be part of the scoring process, I can then change the value for these areas to 0. I don't need these to contribute to the overall mark, but I do need to identify whether the student has achieved satisfactory or unsatisfactory for another part of the marking. So you don't need a separate rubric to deal with satisfactory and unsatisfactory if you have elements like that in your tasks as well as scored parts. You can put them both within the same rubric by adding in another criterion group, and you can have as many of those as you like. So when we looked at that example of the OSCE before, where they separated out some areas that had 3 scales, others had 5, 6, others had 2, all you need to do is create separate criterion groups inside your rubric, and that will allow you to define how many actual columns you want for your marking in different areas of the rubric. So it's quite versatile. All right, moving on to the overall score element. You may recall that I showed you as part of the analytics that we were looking at before, we wanted to see the spread of the marks for a particular task. In case we've forgotten what that looks like, maybe I'll find it again in here somewhere. Actually, let's have a look at the marking for one of these papers again. Each of the rubrics that sit inside your assessment marking interface will have 3 dots next to it that you can click on and also jump to the stats that way. So you can either get to it through the subject admin area and looking at your rubrics there in the list, or in your actual assessments, once it's been attached, you'll find that there is a stats area that you can jump to from here. And that will give you, inside a window, the same spread of the marks. In case this is a satisfactory, unsatisfactory rubric, you can get that same spread. But that's only going to happen if, when you're building the rubric, you spend the time defining the overall score area. It's very important so that you can get that top-down spread of the grade distribution. So in this case, we've been marking out of 100, so I'm going to need 5 columns. So I'm going to add another column in and then define HD through to fail and what those values are, for example. So you're going to need to figure out the numbers. If it's out of 100, this is going to be particularly easy. We know that a HD, for example, is 85% or more out of 100. Distinction, it's going to be 75 or more. Credit, it's going to be 65 or more. Pass, 50 or more. And then fail, 0 or more. So it'll be 0 up to 49, etc. If it's out of 100 when you do a rubric, this part is going to be really easy. So it's another good reason for why scoring out of 100 in a rubric might be a good idea for you. It will convert whatever this value is back to the task weighting. All right, so apart from not putting in any descriptions, etc., I now have a rubric that's tallying out of 100. I've taken the time to define the overall score area, which means I can use the analytics when I'm going through the marking process. And the last part that we have, HD needs to be the max value when you're defining the scores for the individual criterion, Michelle. That's a really good question. It's got to be the max here when you're defining how much each criterion is worth. In the overall score section down the bottom, it changes it because it wants to know this or more number. So it's going to be the bottom. I hope that makes sense to you. I'm happy to talk to you about it afterwards if you like. All right, the last thing that we need to do in building our rubric is to go into the options area down the bottom. And this is where we're going to talk about visibility. When it says at the beginning the default value is rubric is visible to students, it will mean that it is put in front of them as a part of the submission process. So when they go to submit an assignment, they'll have to scroll all the way through all the rubric criterion, etc., before they can actually locate and submit their assignment, if it's a file submission, for example. Most academics that I work with take the position that the rubric is available to the students in full in the subject outline. So I don't need it to be visible or to make the submission process longer by putting that inside the description of all of the academic integrity information and other things before they can submit their assignment. So usually people are choosing the rubrics hidden from students as part of the submission process, and that we generally provide it back to them as a part of their feedback after they submit. So this is the most common setting. Either rubric is hidden from them and it's included as part of their feedback, or that it's hidden from students until their feedback is actually published. Much of a muchness, really. They both work towards the same end. The other thing you'll need to decide is, do you want the students to know the numbers? Do you want them to see the tallying inside the rubric? So we're talking about here, do I want the students to see that they got 7.95 or whatever for this particular criterion, and then potentially want to argue about why it was not 7.96 or 7.91, etc.? Or do you just want them to get the actual criterion score itself, which means HD, distinction, credit, pass, fail for each individual one? That's up to you. It's a pretty even split in terms of academics that I work with, whether they want those numbers to be provided back to the students. If you don't want them to see those scores and just see their total for the task, hide the scores from the students. Now, lastly, the description area down the bottom here is not visible to students. So if you wanted to put in a description for your colleagues, etc., to see around a rubric when they're going through the list of rubrics in subject admin, you would put it in here. I don't generally bother with that myself. All right. There's two areas down the bottom here that talk about linking rubrics to competencies and ePortfolio. You can ignore this. We don't use these tools. They're not turned on. So you can move right on from that section. Remembering that this whole thing auto saves, we can now close. And we've now created a rubric ready to attach to an assignment. So the next thing I'm going to work through is attaching it to an assessment and then marking with it. So let me stop there and see if anyone has any burning questions, comments around what we've looked at in building a rubric so far. Anybody? I think we're okay to keep going for the moment. If you do have one, put it in the chat or bring me up later. Okay, I have a lot of rubrics in this list ready to be attached or that have already been attached, hence the link. Some of them that I've used for marking, etc. as well. If you've got a lot of rubrics and you want to be able to find one easily, I'll give you a tip, stick a number in front of it. That will actually put it to the top of the list. It'll always look for a number and then a letter. So it's alphabetized, but if you want to jump the queue, put a number in front. All right, so I have a lot of rubrics in here that I can attach to my assessments. Let's go through the process now of attaching a rubric to one of my assessment tasks. So if I jump into my assignment dashboard, I'll find a task that I can attach an assessment to. Maybe we'll just build a new one. This will do. New assignment. And where we attach a rubric for marking is here underneath evaluation and feedback. Then we have the option to add one or more rubrics. Remember, we saw some examples with 4 rubrics attached. I'm going to add a rubric. You could start the rubric building process from scratch here by selecting Create New, but to be honest, I always build mine in the subject admin area in advance, getting ready to attach it. So I'm going to choose Add Existing, and then you get to work through your list. Remembering, as I said before, that unless your rubric has been set to published, you're not going to be able to find it in this list. If you're not sure which rubric it actually is referring to in here, you can preview them on the right-hand side. But I'm going to find one in this list. Does anyone remember what I called it before? It's probably A something. God, there's a lot in this list. Might be right down the bottom. Here we go, A1 name of task. So this is the very empty rubric that I just created. I'm going to select that and add it to this task. Random task for marking, that'll do. I've attached a rubric over here. I can open it up and see the criterion in brief in this condensed view, but I can see here it's scored out of 100, and then it shows me each of the individual criterion and their scores, etc. So that's fine. I'm ready to mark this task. I'm going to say as part of this process that this is going to be worth 30%. So the rubric will score out of 100, and when it's finished that process, it will convert that percentage to a score out of 30 automatically. So hit save and close. This amazing assignment is now ready for use. And assuming that I've got submissions in here waiting from my students, I can then mark with this rubric. So that would involve me opening up the submission dashboard, going to evaluate any particular student. And here is my rubric on the right. It gives me a condensed view. I can open it up and it will show me each of the individual criterion. This is probably a little too small for my liking. Hang on, I'll do this for a moment. You may or may not be aware. When you click on Add Rubric, Add Existing is underneath, as long as you've created a rubric before, Scott. All right, so I get this brief view of my rubric here on the right-hand side. If this is too squished for you, you've got 2 options. One of them is to use the handlebars that are here in the middle. I can left click and drag, and that will give me as much space as I like. To look at the full description of the rubric, I can hover my mouse on each of the criterion and you'll see the scales are coming up. I haven't put much in my descriptions here, but you can see what I'm talking about. And over here on the right hand side, you're going to see the baseline mark that will be selected when your markers choose this. So if I clicked on credit, it's allocating 15 out of 30, but your markers can then click inside this box and change that value to whatever they want to. The thing to look out for here that they must be aware of is that this is not going to behave by any rules about what these other values are or where these different scales start or end. So even though we've chosen 15 as our starting point for a credit, I could put in here 29 and it's still going to say credit 29 out of 30. So that's not accurate. So people need to be aware when they're marking of what those boundaries sort of look like. So if I had set this as the top of the band for a credit at 74%, I'd be saying to the markers, make sure you adjust it down within that scale so that it still stays within that boundary. If you click another criterion area, it will reset that value back to whatever that baseline value is here. So if I went back to credit now, it's gone back to 15. So jumping between them, it will give you your marker the starting point, and you can see the tally is here up the top, 22.5. And then we would then work through providing a score for each criterion scale in the rubric. Remembering we added a satisfactory, unsatisfactory section at the bottom. And the other thing that you'll notice inside the rubric tool is that you can add individual feedback against each criterion scale. So at that point, if I wanted to talk to John about criterion 1, I could put feedback in here about that. If I wanted it to be more than text, I have a few options here in the editor, such as the insert stuff option, which would allow me to actually link back to either file attachments if I wanted them, or to other things like video notes or audio notes. So it's the type of feedback you can provide at the criterion level is quite versatile, is what I'm getting at. Some people provide criterion level feedback. Some people highlight and annotate the text submission from the student. Some people provide all of their feedback inside the overall feedback area. And some people use all three. It's completely at your discretion what types of feedback and where you want to provide them to the student. But what I'm telling you is that the rubric tool allows you to provide that feedback at an individual criterion level if you're inclined to use that. That's up to you. We'll notice here that the rubric has been tallying the scores that I've been adding in, giving us a total at the moment of 58.75 out of 100. And our overall score, which we took the time to define, is saying that in the rubric out of 100, this equates to a pass. Okay? And Brightspace has now converted 58.75 out of 100 into a value out of 30. So the conversion happens automatically between rubric and task weighting. So that's pretty good. And if you change that result within the rubric, this will similarly adjust. So if I turned around and said, actually, this was something else. We now have 48.75 and it has changed it. So it's doing it as we go. So that is the rubric tool in flight when we've attached it for marking. If you're not happy with this condensed view and you just want to see an A4-esque page with the rubric, with all of the criterion descriptors, etc., you can pop out the rubric in the top right here, and that will give you the full page view, including all the numbers and the ability to add criterion level feedback. So if you want to work with it all within one screen, rather than using that condensed built-in view, you can open up the rubric in full. Clicking over on the right-hand side will allow you to modify the individual scores away from whatever your base starting point was. So yes, you can grade within a range, but what Brightspace allows us to do is select the starting point in the rubric. So that is a lightning tour of marking within the Brightspace rubric tool. I'll stop there and see if anyone has any burning questions about marking with the rubric tool. Anyone at all? Questions, comments, objections? Any of the above? I guess not. Sounds like we're good to keep going. Okay, thanks, Sonia. Uh, all right, I'm going to close this submission now. Keep in mind that like all marking that happens inside an assignment or a quiz, you're probably going to need to save this. If you publish it, it's going straight to the student. So you probably want to save this as draft, but because you've taken the time to mark in the rubric tool, even though this hasn't been published to the student, we now get our statistics that we can access on how marking is going for this task. So if I now went back into my rubric list, I'm going to go into subject admin, rubrics, let's find it somewhere. And the rubric that I just made was called something like random something or other, A1 name of task. Here it is. It's now locked because I've begun marking with it, but I can look at the statistics for this rubric. And under competency activities, it will now tell me how many submissions, what's the average mark, and I can use the actions button to start diving into the spread of scores within each of the individual criterion. And then I can dig further into my individual student grades and what this guy was doing when he was marking, etc. All of that happens as a result of setting up the rubric properly. It's available for you, even though it hasn't been published yet. So you can absolutely do at least part of the moderation process without the papers needing to be marked. That's the important bit of information here. All right, I'll jump back to my Padlet board and see where I need to go from next. We talked about building a rubric. We worked through the overall score and why it's important. We went through the options at the end. We also went through marking with a rubric. We had a look at how that works. We've been playing around with the statistics and the analytics in the rubric tool and how you get access to those. You can use a rubric to create satisfactory and unsatisfactory tasks, but let me go a step further and show you how you do it so it talks to your gradebook. If I jump back into my subject site, what you need to understand with a rubric where you're grading out of grading a satisfactory, unsatisfactory task is that satisfactory, unsatisfactory in Brightspace language is either a 0 or a 1. So you're still creating an assignment that has a score. It's going to be out of 1. It's going to send it through to your gradebook to a column in the gradebook that will read a 0 or a 1 as either satisfactory or unsatisfactory, which means that the rubric that gets attached to this needs to be scored out of, will be converted to a value out of 1. Right, so what that means is that you can still have a rubric out of 100%, but unless the student is getting 100 in the rubric, this is going to end up being less than 1, which means it will be unsatisfactory. So you can grade in a rubric. I'm going to find a rubric that I can attach here. There's the add existing function, Scott, for you. Add rubric, add existing. I might find one in my list that actually is satisfactory, unsatisfactory. There's got to be one in here somewhere. Do I have one on hand? Maybe. That'll do. The insert button for this is right down the bottom, add selected. So if you can't find it, that's why it's down the bottom. So it's going to ultimately be scored out of 1. I've attached a rubric, and the marking process for this, if we have a look at this rubric, it has a criterion, one or more criterion where the student must achieve a score of 1 to be able to pass the task. So that's how it works. The rubric will convert whatever that total tally is to a value out of 1. So that means the students will need to get full marks essentially for each of the criterion in there. I'd suggest if you want to build a satisfactory, unsatisfactory rubric that you log a job with DLT, and we can get one of the LROs or myself, etc., to help you with setting that up in the first place. But ultimately, what you need to know is that the assignment or the quiz or the discussion forum, whatever the assessment is, will need to be scored out of 1. That's where it ends up, because it will end up going into the gradebook for the students with that value being represented as either a 0 or a 1, satisfactory, unsatisfactory. All right, let's jump back to my board. Now, on the Padlet board today, and I'll give you a link to this, there is a tool that Sam Parker put together called the Rubric Generator, and this is a ThinkSpace page. Put it in the chat here. There's a ThinkSpace page which links to information about a tool that Sam built, which is an add-on for Microsoft Word that you can download and install on your own version of Word. There's a video here that will walk you through it, and it will allow you to copy and paste entire rows or entire tables from the subject outline tool into Microsoft Word and then export it into Brightspace. There's a little bit of a process to walk through, etc. But if you watch that video, Sam will walk you through it. This is for those of you who don't want to build the rubric in Brightspace. So if you want to walk through that process, this is the page that you need to go to walk through it. I'm probably on the fence about it, to be honest. I've used the rubric generator tool and it's fine for you to work through. But by the time I've gone through installing it and copying and pasting different cells in a subject outline tool and then exporting and then importing back into Brightspace, part of me thinks I probably should have just built it in Brightspace from the get-go. So it's up to you if you want to have a look and a play around with the rubric generator tool. All staff have access to it, but it's going to involve a little bit of work. Okay, and at the end of the Padlet wall, I have provided a link to a bunch of different resources around using the rubric tool. So that includes, if I put this a little larger, there's a quick guide there on using the rubric tool that you can download. There is a link to the CSU Brightspace help page, which actually will walk you through a number of the steps that we've looked at today, how to create them, how to use them, how to mark with them. Those can be accessed from the Brightspace help page. And there's also a link to the actual vendor page to do with using rubrics as well. So all of those might be of value to you. The quick guide, I think, is about 6 pages in length, but it will take you through screenshots, etc., of most of the information I've covered today. So if you are keen to get a hold of that document as well, it's a PDF on how to use, build, work with rubrics as well. So that all of that can be accessed from the Padlet board used for today's presentation. I'll grab the link for that now again into the chat, and then I'll have a look at some of the questions and see if people have got particular things they want me to work through. All right, so questions. Sonia put something there before. Okay, OSCEs. Setting up, how does the system transfer each criteria which is marked from 1 to 5 and then make an overall mark of either satisfactory or unsatisfactory? Yeah, look, that's very, very tricky to set up scoring out of multiple criteria. So levels, that example we looked at before had 6 levels sometimes, or 5 levels or more. Ultimately, someone is manually putting in a 0 or a 1. Getting the OSCE mark to convert to either 0 or 1 is going to be quite complex, because you'll need to determine what that pass mark is. I think in the nursing one I saw, they needed to score more than 23 on the tool. But I think we probably need to have a look at it together in person and work through it. Sonia, it's quite complex in that sense. Thanks, everybody. For those of you that need to take off, by all means, the recording will be made available through the channel and also through the Teams event list. On the right, there's a link to the assets column that where I store the files, the slides, the recordings, etc. Okay, Jane Lawrence, you have a question.
Yes, I popped it in the chat, but it was quite a while ago. I'm just wondering, can you download the export the analytics that you showed us at the beginning of the presentation?
You
Is
can
that
print them.
exportable?
It's not exportable as a file as such. So you're not going to get an Excel sheet with them all in columns, etc. You would end up printing PDFs of the web pages.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool.
Is the long short of. So unfortunately, there are a number of areas within Brightspace that you can't get reports from like that. Not to mention, I guess, the fact that the rubric tool workaround where we were looking at those analytics is not connected to whether or not they are published. So in a sense, it's a live representation of all of the marking going on. If I can find some others in here. Here's another one, 506. Let's have a look at that. Subject admin, rubrics. Find a rubric that was used. This was in 60, so we should get some good results here. View the stats. Competency. There's the spread. Average was a HD. Amazing. Click on actions. That'll give us the breakdown. So this is looking probably more like a hurdle task to me if they're all scoring that highly, but let's have a look. Criteria stats, there were 13 submissions there. There's a breakdown of each of the individual criteria, and you'll notice that there is no export function. So at that point, you're printing a web page. So Control P, give me a PDF. How many pages in the PDF? See what I mean? Now you can change it to landscape if you like, but it's capturing the web pages if you're printing it that way. Yeah.
Cool, thanks.
No problem at all. Carolyn says, I had a subject that used full marks and then they've removed it. Does the full marks column need to be used at all? So that full marks column is part of Sam's rubric generator tool. It adds it on the end there. It doesn't have an impact on it. When you use either custom points or points, it does the same thing, but the rubric tool that Sam creates adds in another column for the viewer. It doesn't have an impact on whether it's effective or not for tallying. Yep, no problem. I might stop the recording there. If anyone has any other questions, etc., I'm happy to hang around and answer those for at least a couple of minutes.